that you've all chosen to be here today. And again, the encouragement to observe with our eyes with this open heart, and to listen with our ears with this open heart, and to be very attentive and aware of what's coming forth in that capacity. And last week, we touched into waking up through these temporary states. And this week, we're touching into growing up through these more permanent stages, these places of life which are, pretty well enduring, that reflect a center of gravity that we hold. And it is through our eyes and through our ears, what we see and hear, and what's happening in our immediate life conditions, that is a key factor in our waking up, this vertical development that we spoke of the first time. And Ken Wilber often cites Saint Bonaventure, who speaks of the eye of flesh and the eye of mind and the eye of contemplation, to reflect essentially these physical intelligences and seeing the world through only our physical intelligences, to also then grow into these subtle intelligences, and then into these very, very subtle intelligences. So the eye of body, or the eye of flesh, the eye of mind, and the eye of contemplation. And as our senses grow up, our sight, what we're looking, what we're observing, it grows up into witnessing. It grows up into insight. So there's an interiorization that comes forth to these physical senses. Similarly, what we're listening to, what we're hearing is a sense. Listening adds the intention onto that. So there's an inner element in listening that isn't present in hearing. And as that grows up into attunement, to listening to what isn't said. Perhaps you recall the first day we spoke of aloha, and referencing aloha as seeing what isn't seen and hearing what isn't said. And so there is a presence and a mindfulness inherent within that. Now, the video that we watched, to me, really embodies what a mindful, integral, immanent embodiment entails. And that's about perspective after perspective after perspective after perspective. We might say that as consciousness matures, so too does compassion. As perspective taking increases, so too does empathy giving. And the more perspectives that we include in anything, the more sustainable, the more enduring the results and the processes and the intentions that give rise to that are going to be. That's what growing up is all about. Now, a brief little odyssey through these growing up stages looks a little like this. So it used to be that we thought of human development in terms that children grow up. And then once we get to adulthood, we just sort of flatland. Now that changed rapidly when postmodernism came forth. What you might have read in terms of the individualist or the pluralist or this green orientation. Because now there's all of a sudden this recognition that adults also grow up, that our inner worlds and our worldviews and our capacity to take perspectives and make meaning also shift as we shift, or at least they can. And it was really insightful for me working in environments that had very different worldviews than what I held. And those were, to put it very frankly, workers who were working in very concrete industries who had a very my way or the highway opportunistic orientation. And, if you recall the old sitcom in the 70s, Archie Bunker, and do y'all know Archie Bunker's place? One of his lines was,
oh yeah,
there's actually a video online, one of his lines where he's talking about, let's make America great again. And we're going to put these sort of people over here, and these sort of people over here, and these sort of people over here, and we're going to make them all separate based on how they look. That's an opportunistic, that's a red orientation. That is what I'm describing in these earlier sort of work environments that I was working in. And I thought, this is so different. And I'd also been working a lot in indigenous communities and recognizing a very different way of knowing and a very different way of being. Okay. So, early in adulthood, we have this my way or the highway. It's all about me. It's about personal power. It's this red opportunistic orientation. And most of us grow out of that. And when we grow out of that, we tend to move into this blue orientation. And it's about a diplomat. And it's about structure and obedience and and essentially sacrificing one's life for a higher power. Okay, so red, that first orientation, it's a first person perspective. My way or the highway, it's all about me. The second orientation, we bring in the blue, the diplomat orientation, we now bring in a second person perspective. So there's me and there's you, Chris. But because we've lived in the same place, Chris, we got to think the same. Okay, that's the orientation of this blue, the second orientation. There's no context. It's just, here we are. We're obedient to whatever's the bigger container around us. Both of these first developmental stages have a very, very concrete orientation. That means we see the world through that eye of flesh that St. Bonaventure pointed out. Okay, so we're seeing and we're hearing in the immediate. So everything's very tangible and there isn't a long-term orientation. If the past was crappy, so too is the future. Nothing wrong with that at all. Many, many small towns, small villages, many of our grandparents and our great-grandparents and some of our parents are also coming from this traditional orientation. And they're to be loved and to embrace and held in that capacity. Not in a demeaning way, but in a sufficient way. It's absolutely beautiful. And some of us also continue to grow up into the subtle realm. And this is the eye of mind. And so we're starting to see the world through what's going on inside instead of just what's going on outside. And we start developing our expertise. And we go to college and we get these certificates and we put them up on our walls and we say, hey, look at me, I'm Dr. Devin. Or I'm whatever with this degree or have these specializations and I'm an expert. And, unless you're an expert, you're nobody. That's the orientation with this sort of expert orientation, which is sometimes called amber. And it's all about me, but it's in a very subtle way. And so there's a third person perspective that comes on board. So there's me, there's Chris, and then there's Tim. Okay. Tim's starting to see that there's, some different environments because maybe Tim has never been to Fairfield, Iowa, where Chris and I have both been. So he's starting to see that there's an environmental influence that comes on board. Okay. So he's seen a little more of the picture. But each element is also a whole in itself. So where that first orientation is coming from, he or she, that's the whole world right there. Now, when we got Chris coming on board there with, that second orientation, that second person, the world's getting a little bigger. There's another hole. And then another hole comes on board and we got Tim in the picture. And now we're going to keep growing up here. We're going to bring Claire in the picture. And now Claire's starting to recognize that, Claire's been in Iowa and Claire, like Chris and I, have also been in Hawaii. And he's starting to understand that there's a bigger context here. So that goes beyond just the environment that Tim is seeing, but there's actually a bigger context. And so Claire is, he's probably engaging in scientific research. He's probably very professional in that capacity. He's looking forward to the future and what might become, and he's being very strategic and calculating in that way. And we keep adding more and more, another dimension. So we might bring Cheryl on board now. And, Cheryl understands that in Hawaii, there's this deep sort of relationality. There's, we're all one in this. The Sanskrit phrase namaste really reflects this. I honor the God in you. And, when I'm seeing from that sacred place, I recognize that we're all one. That's a bit of an elaborated version on it. But our circle of care and concern and compassion is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more robust. It's also going deeper. But you know what? All of us also think that our way is the best way. So it might, early on, it's my way or the highway, and that's it. It's the Archie Bunker style. And then it moves in a sort of little house on the prairie style, and we keep evolving. And it's kind of like the Big Bang Theory. You know that show? Sheldon, the main character, he's like super scientific and professional. He's like exemplifies orange and achiever orientation. Whereas his mom is from Texas, and she's from, Texas cattle country, and she's really steeped in the church. And so there's a conflict that comes on board there. So I'm just, kind of putting some archetypes forth. Whereas when we keep growing, bring in the green and this pluralist, individualist orientation, that might be, those Portlandia videos where it's all about local and organic and very sustainabilities from this world. So all of these different worldviews think that their way is the right way and everybody else is wrong. Now, a big shift happens once we move into what's sometimes known as integral or second tier consciousness. And Abraham Maslow called this essentially being needs. So we move from these deficiency needs into these being needs. And all of a sudden we recognize that each piece of the whole is, has a piece of the truth. And nobody's wrong. They're just coming from different places. And so we can really appreciate for the first time. We can embrace, similar to that video, an understanding that there's a rightfulness. No longer are we trying to push change out. We're operating from a very different place. We'll often listen first and then seek to speak after. Very different orientation that comes on board in these kind of integral dimensions. And if you read the Bill Torbert article on action logics, he refers to this in terms of strategist and alchemist. And then the Don Beck video, if you watch that, that's yellow and turquoise teal and the colors that go beyond that. And so a big part of our gathering together as reflective practitioners is that holding an integral space and recognizing that everybody is right from where they're coming from can offer a profound framework for our work in the world, whatever that is. That's not to say that every solution is just as good or that every process is. But again, nobody's smart enough to be wrong 100% of the time. So that's a brief little introduction into these growing up stages. And the center of gravity is that, we're not just one category or one stage, we fluctuate. And, last week we touched into how when we're irritated, when we're stressed, we're going to be coming from more junior places. Whereas, maybe when we're in a state of flow or embracing a transcendent practice, we're coming from a higher place. So center of gravity is where we're operating from most of the time. Final comment, as we grow up, so does our level of complexity. And there's also sort of a refinement that occurs with an integral embrace. And that refinement is sort of the simplicity. We move from being more complicated to being more complex, and also refine into simplicity that comes after that. So a few opening comments from me regarding developmental stages and growing up. I'd warmly welcome comments, reflections on any of this or any of the readings, or also the reflective practice that was encouraged last time about, recognizing when we're growing into complexity, more complex situations, or, reverting into security and safety.
Are you asking for that via the emails, or are you asking for that right now?
The floor is open here, Tim.
Sorry, were you looking for feedback now, or just in general via email?
If you want to bring forth that now, that's you're welcome to do that. Or if you prefer email, that's good too. Okay, Claire.
Yeah. So I thought that the point right there at the end was really nice, where you were bringing up the fact that people are right where they're coming from, but not all those places are right places for all people. So like being able to like understand why somebody's doing something is different than co-signing that and like seeing it as the rightful thing, because you can see why somebody has maybe a messed up perspective on something that is damaging to other people, but you can also understand that they feel that they're right. And sort of the example in my most recent like readings and stuff that has come up was like the rise of like fascism in Europe, just because it was coming from a place where like this system that existed for hundreds of years had like completely failed everybody, and people were really had suffered at the hands of it for for a long time, and they were wanting something to blame. And fascism is like turning a colonial mindset, which is like a hyper extension of all European political mindsets to that point into itself. Sort of, it's applying colonial mindsets to your own people. So you can see why that was appealing and why that was a choice that they made, but ultimately why it was like a wrong thing and why it caused so much more pain. So kind of
Awesome. Yeah, awesome, Clay. And we can also see in systems. So, like, take a political system. A couple of years ago, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were there was a conflict in place. One candidate was coming from a red, amber, orange center of gravity. The other was very, very green. And so, how they were seeing the world was coming from very different places. They were both right from where they're coming from. One is very focused on concrete actions, on jobs and building barriers. The other is expanding and opening it up for, this humanitarian or this humanistic sort of embrace. Different approaches based on where they're coming from. Any comments, Emmanuel?
Well, not from me at this point. I was kind of curious to hear from other people what, how the reading landed with you guys, and if there's any questions around any certain aspects of the reading, or I mean, generally kind of who was doing the reading and who watched the video, kind of a thing.
I'm going to go. I'm just going to jump in. But it reminds me a bit also of, I guess, chakra systems, or Carolyn May's, when she's talking about anatomy. I don't know if it's the book Anatomy of an Illness, or also the Jewish sort of tree of life, or Maslow's hierarchy of there's these. It was neat to see I really like the videos because it goes through this sort of evolution, and we take with us those historic, what's before us. I mean, there's these pieces right in us, so I could really identify with a lot of the pieces as the video was going through sort of the world changes, and even when there was kind of that violence and the red, I was like, oh, well, there's a big piece of red in me. There's a big piece of, the beige is even there. There's all these parts. And I really think when I was in college, Maslow effect sort of struck a chord with me so much, because it was like, especially with, kind of the appeal to the masses or the public, like if you want to, suck them where their fear is, scare them kind of thing. They will sort of go there because it's just like your base, your base sort of place that if you start to get fearful, you'll get sort of stuck in that place, or you might buy into. I just think of when, the Twin Towers were hit and everybody got scared, I think it was President Bush coming on, and you have to have a family sort of emergency plan. And I'm like, I'm not having a family emergency plan. Please don't give me your you're fear-based because you're getting me stuck here. I don't like this place. But it is a growing up. And I think as you grow, and, that's the coolest part of growing up, whether you're growing in your job or with your family or with yourself, is that you move through these places, and you go back, like, I had a beige moment today, I'm sure of it. And you go back and forth, but as you grow, you kind of, the stages, you can go, okay, that was a beige, that was a beige moment, or that was a red moment. But like where I'm at, or where I'm kind of striving for, is this, really love the colors and the sort of the flow colors, the yellow and the the teal colors. It's like, oh yeah, I am growing, or my style might be growing, or my impact. There is this opportunity for growth and appreciation of all the parts, and not to go, okay, this part is bad. It's really a part of your, your DNA, your heritage, your, whatever. It's that part that is still, it's there, still makes you a whole. So that's my ramble about.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, Cheryl. And Ken Wilber talks about transcending and including. So we transcend the details and we retain the essence. And that essence is still there. And we can still draw on that. So, if I'm coming from a green place, I also have each of the earlier colors in that. And that's something to, I think to really embrace and to draw on. Yeah.
I thought like the part in the video, I did both the reading and the video, but the part in the video where they were sort of talking about how there isn't really a solution in the stage that you're in, and how the stage you're in only, and like the advances it gives you only serves to show you the problems with it, and that you're always like sort of seeking that higher perspective on things was really interesting. That there isn't really an endpoint on integrating things, and like having things slide into a lower, or sorry, to like the next thing, because you can only find the solution to where you are by expanding your perspective. And that was interesting, just in context of the reading, that I was just going through, and sort of you gave us sort of an assignment to find places where we've been sort of growing, or working past our potential maybe, or and then areas where we've been striving towards more of like a comfortable place. And in all of the lowest efficiency leadership action logics, every single one like strives for a place of comfort and control, and like whether that's like direct control over the situation, or controlling it by controlling others' emotions, by being sort of diplomatic about things, or just by like not listening to others at all and just staying with what you know. All of those action logics went strongly one way. And when they were sort of taking that time at the end of the reading to go over what those logics meant, one point they made was that the jumps between those first three categories are pretty simple, but the tightest bottleneck is between achiever and an individualist, because an achiever is kind of giving you what you need at a comfortable place consistently without a lot of the negative, but you're not getting any really advancing perspective. You're kind of like working right at 100%. And so like that just like interesting that like once you move past that point, you're starting to see the action logics at the place of insecurity, at the place of growth, trending towards that direction. So always addressing problems by like a higher intelligence or a higher perspective. So.
Yeah, keen insights there, Claire. Particularly, these lower ones are more concrete, and they seek security, and they seek comfort, and that's a more contractive direction, and that can also be important. Can also be incredibly important. And there's a fellow named Robert Keegan, a developmentalist, and he talks about being had by and having. Okay, so we're had by something, and then eventually we grow and we have it. And so, just in reference to controlling there, Claire. And again, he's a developmentalist. Great insights. Chris, Rob, Janet, Tim, Ryan?
I can, this is Janet, I can pop in.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I just want to start out and say that all of everything that we've read, every discussion that we've had, the videos that we've watched, all of them have served to be both a reminder of what I've grown into, and also confirmation of what I know to be true for myself. And I opted to read the article first, and then I kind of half-heartedly watched the video this morning a little bit as I was trying to do some other stuff. But I got through that article, and I read through all of those different descriptions of the leadership styles, and I could see bits and pieces of myself in most of them. But then I got to the alchemist and the alchemical style of leadership, and I was a little bit blown away because I saw myself about 95% there, and I'm really sitting with that in a big way. I'm not quite sure what to do with that, but it describes exactly how I have taught myself how to walk through the world, and it's what I knew to be true when I was just a small child. And for my survival's sake, I had to adopt some of those other, for lack of a better way to put it, lower energy styles of moving through the world. And in the course of my growing up, have done my very best to adopt what's more true for me, which lands smack dab in that alchemical arena. And so I'm kind of sitting with that, and not quite sure exactly where I'm going with that and how it's going to inform me in my days to come. But something that I definitely want to speak to, Devin, is you mentioned compassion just a little bit ago, and I've been doing some huge work around compassion, and how I got to that was, I'm a massage therapist, and I do way more than massage in my practice. Energy work and Reiki. I've been formally trained in Reiki, but what I do on that table for those folks is something way different than what I ever learned in my Reiki classes. And so people consequently call me a healer, and I have been taking not offense to it, but it's kind of ruffled my feathers to be called a healer, and for some very practical reasons. The one being is that there are some people who have a mindset, well, if I go to my healer, they'll fix me. Well, in my experience as the healer, or the one holding space for that sacred shift, is that I'm not doing anything really, that it's a joint effort, or it's not happening at all. But anyway, so back to the whole energy healer thing. And it's like, well, what is my issue with energy? Why such an issue? And I just sat with that, and I walked through my days with that, and I came up with, energy is nothing more than let's see, I had a term for it, bioresonant harmonics, and that really rung a great big bell for me. It's more about communication that in that realm. And as I was sitting with that, even that more, what that really shakes out to be is compassion. And so I just want to thank you for bringing up the word compassion, for reminding me that that's part and parcel of where I'm sitting with right now. And I'm grateful today also to be reminded that whatever level we are at, we have our truth. And I needed that reminder. So thank you so much.
Yeah. So appreciate you bringing that forth, Janet. And
thank you.
I'm also I'd love to hear anything that arises as you walk through and sit with some of these things that are coming together in the last couple of weeks, and what comes forth. I'd love to learn more about that as it happens. If you'd like to share that,
I would love to. Yes.
Beautiful. Rob,
thank you.
Chris, Tim, Ryan, any comments?
I can share that I first watched the video, and for me that wasn't as, it's funny, I don't even recall as much about it. It wasn't as compelling, and partly I think it's that it's complex enough, and I wasn't sitting there stopping it and taking notes and trying to create a thread that I was, like a chain that I was following. So I found that a little challenging. I read the leadership, which was way more concrete, partly because it was focused in, one aspect of, I guess, one developmental line. And I found that both, I really appreciated that article, both in the way that it shows how people can have a somewhat linear developmental style, but it seemed like, too, that it might be that some of those, I almost felt like, sorry, I've got lots of thoughts at once. I almost felt like there were certain styles, like the expert style, that seemed almost less likely to bump up into the next phase. I wasn't sure if it was linear, I guess, is what I'm saying. It seemed like there were maybe a couple of things. Like I could see how it was almost like there were two parallel lines, and one of them tended to be a little bit more dismissive of relationships, and the other tended to be a little bit more aware of relationships, and then using that to be interested in other things, so they could speak to the experts, so they could speak, to the engineers, the accountants, the whatever. So I was a little uncertain about how to turn that into a pure holarchic progression. But I loved how, I just thought from a business standpoint, it was a beautiful article, and I really related to, I immediately thought of individual people I've known in positions of responsibility. And I was also curious to know whether other typologies, whether it's the spiral dynamics one, or whether it's Enneagram, or even sort of constitutional typologies, would tend to push people toward individual modes of leadership. And again, it seems like it's not necessarily a linear thing that everybody's going to be able to go through all these things, but some people by temperament or by personality type or something are more likely to be in a couple of those phases and not every single one. So that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I have a couple of comments. One is pre-integral, we tend to grow into the container that's immediately around us. And so that an implication is in our higher education, for example, if our higher education is a conventional business program, that's going to grow us into the expert achiever orientation. Similarly, say a sustainable living program, or a program in some of the healing modalities, is tending to have a center of gravity that is more around that individual, pluralistic, that green orientation. We tend to grow into the containers that is around us. I also want to draw back into the point earlier about Robert Keegan, and first we're had by, and then we have. So when we look at expert and achiever, all we're really talking about here is an early and a later phase. In other words, being had by, and then having this subtle individual orientation. So subtle meaning our orientation is, it's very subtle, and it's firstly about me. But the latter, the achiever, is a maturation of the expert. Just a couple comments in that regard. Yeah. Rob, Chris, anything from you?
I wanted to also add a comment. I think Tim picked up on something that's really kind of inherent in spiral dynamics, and not so much talked about in the other kind of typologies, which is this move from individual to collective and back. And that's oftentimes, in spiral dynamics, that's oftentimes kind of described as one of the models for development, is that we kind of, we have these kind of two extremes of like just focusing on myself and being completely absorbed in like the group that I'm in or the environment that I'm in. And so the development goes from kind of a more individualistic point of view, with red and opportunist, to a more collective point of view with blue and diplomat, to a more individualistic view with orange and achiever, back to a more collective view with the individualist and green, and then into an integral view. So there's this, Tim, as you kind of said, there's this like dynamic between individual and collective that we often, see as a model for development, how we negotiate between these two extremes.
Yeah, and systems are also reflected too. So we can work in an organization that might have a center of gravity that is different than where we are. And we might think, well, how come they don't get it? We'll talk like that. Well, the system is operating from a different place. It's not going to get it.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me back to what Claire was saying also, because Claire mentioned, this idea that the achiever is kind of where a lot of people kind of bottom out in corporate America. And one of my interpretations for that is because, corporate America and traditional capitalism is like really grounded in this orange worldview. And so that's why people, that come from an orange worldview seem to, be best adapted to an orange system, whether that's corporate America or corporate American capitalism in general. Chris, did you want to say something?
I do have something to say about, first, I guess I watched the video and I went through the article too. And the video, mainly I thought about like how, and I feel like this has come up before when I was talking about integral, either with you, Devin, or Emmanuel at some point, just the micro and macro kind of back and forth between, these stages of society and development of civilization on the macro level, but then also how we as individuals follow that to an extent as a person. I think that's really interesting. I was thinking about that while I was watching the video, so I wanted to bring that up because I think it also ties into the document. And when I was reading the document, I've been doing a lot of research, right, for this project that I've been working on. So what's come up a lot for that, it's kind of like personal development through adventure kind of thing, and understanding where you are in your story. But then there's also a bunch of narratives happening all at once. You don't just have one story, you have a bunch of sort of simultaneous narratives all happening simultaneously, and they're all at different points. And you talk about the hero's journey and things like, the work that Joseph Campbell brought to everybody, essentially, in terms of discovering these stories. And I think it's interesting with the collective and the individual, because really, we pretty much all start with a collective of some kind. And I think from there, you go from collective to individual, and then you find maybe a new collective, right, or something. And then it's that cycle where you're figuring that out. But that is actually the way the hero's journey is as well. You start at home, you start at safety, and there's this sort of inciting event that brings about some sort of impetus to push you out into an uncomfortable place where you have to confront some things. You end up, in the cave and deal with the ordeal. But when you come out of that as the individual, because the key to that sort of story dynamic is you can be on the path with friends and family, and you can be on the path with a group or a collective even, or at least part of it. But then eventually what it comes down to is you overcoming something, and it's usually an internal process. But I think there's a lot of reflection to the outside world no matter what. But you come out of that, and the key to that is that you've come out of it with something. And I think there's something really interesting in that part of the hero's journey, because you've overcome the ordeal, but it's not over. there's still the road back, and there's still returning with the elixir, essentially. And those two things have to do with the collective. And so the road back is just a struggle, even just to get back to the point where you know what you have. You've developed something, you've overcome something, but you don't really know what it is. And I think that when we talk about achievement and orange orientation, a lot of achievement is just achievement for the sake of achievement. And it's missing maybe fulfillment because it's not connected to something here, something on that purpose level, and something for the collective and contribution. And the end of the hero's journey arc is to arrive back at the original, at your home, transformed, transmuted in some way even, and arrive with the elixir, which can be something you bring internally back to the collective to enhance it, or you arrive with a new collective as a catalyst for some other thing to happen. And so I think that all ties in really. Of course, I study this all the time, so I'm thinking about it all the time anyway. But I think this cycle is repeating, and like I said, the multiple narrative thing. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's
yeah, great stuff, Chris. And I think like next week or when we get together again, we're gonna talk about the quadrants. And so here we're talking about the individual and the collective. And if we bring the hero's journey, another way to look at it, the other part of the quadrant is bringing in the inner and the outer. So the hero's journey, it starts out with, we're living this ordinary life in this outer world. And then we go into this inner world. And then we come back home and we integrate the two worlds. And so we're bringing the inner and the outer and the individual and the collective all together. That might be another way to view it there. Awesome stuff, Chris. Rob, any comments for you before we move to Ryan?
Yeah, so I watched the video, but judging from how people have been responding to the article, I'm going to go read that after the call. I don't know, Spiral Dynamics is probably one of the most, if not the most amazing model I've ever come across. I think, for me, there's nothing really more fascinating than the development of consciousness, and having a way to depict and map that is, just kind of blows me away. I don't really have anything specifically to share.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. Yeah, really appreciate the contribution. Ryan?
I've been enjoying this discussion. I don't really have anything to say at the moment, but maybe I'll just pose a question here for everyone. There seems to be a lot of disagreement in the integral community on what actually constitutes teal, second tier, integral, alchemist stage, whatever. And one of my questions I like to think about that helps me to clarify what this stage is what are some of the disqualifying features that someone would have to exhibit in which you would say, yeah, that's not how a second tier person behaves, acts, thinks, etc. What are some things to watch out for, so to speak? So when we're assessing policies or systems or people or cultures, and there's a debate about, is this integral, is this not integral, right? Or how do you nudge it in the right direction? Or how can we be change agents or catalysts in society or community? Like, what are some things to look out for? Like, yeah, that was full on red, or that was full on orange or green or something. Any checklist we can come up with in like 2 minutes?
People who feel the need to say that they're in the second tier probably aren't.
I love it.
Swaha, Rob. Excellent. I mean, that was succinct and awesome. Chris?
I don't have anything for that. I'm still kind of learning the integral. I have exposure to it, but I definitely feel like I'm less familiar with it, and it's probably been a couple years since Hawaii since we really did any exercises with it. So I'm getting back into it. So
yeah. Any other comments to questions? What are the disqualifiers of an integral center of gravity?
Well, I guess for the sorry, Claire.
Yeah, I think like a big one is just like, are you assessing how to like change others or change a system? Because I feel like individual change doesn't really generate anything. It's only in changing systems that you're like really viewing things from a holistic perspective. So anybody who's like focusing on maybe two or one tier down and not focusing on like the sufficiencies and of a system, I think that's problematic.
It's interesting when we look at systems thinking. Brief little comment here. We can't really embody systems thinking pre-integral consciousness. We can learn systems thinking as a technique that is something outside of ourselves and do exercises to understand that, but we're not actually holding it and living from it until an integral place. So that's one of the core elements that comes on board with that strategist or that yellow orientation. So what Claire brings forth is that, personal change may not matter, but I would suggest that pre-yellow or pre-strategist, that's where people are coming from. They're making personal change. They're making perhaps change in community, and they're using language around change making. Change making isn't the sort of language that comes forth in an integral embrace. It is oriented towards, part of the language that I'm starting to use is that of a wisdom worker. So we're embracing our own unique self and our own unique capacities to become more and more of who we already are in service of something that is beyond ourselves, that also includes systemic impact. But I mean, I appreciate your points there, Claire, absolutely.
I think going back to what disqualifies second tier, I think maybe a characteristic that would qualify it, and then you could take the vice versa to disqualify, would be the ability to really treat people as individuals. If we assume that people are coming from the same tier that we are, or we're saying that oh, we should all get along, like I don't see color, like all religions are right, or whatever, like a very green space, like neither of those are really seeing people for who they are in their uniqueness and their differences.
Yeah. Clear insights, Rob. Thank you for that. Seeing a lot of some head shakes in the room here, Rob.
Oh, really?
Regard. Yeah.
Head shakes as in that's wrong?
Head shakes as in it's right, or agreement,
okay.
affirmative.
Nods.
Yeah, nods. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So we have just a few minutes left here, and I wanted to. There's a comment on the side here from Tim. Gonna rewatch that video. Curious, or for more simple descriptions of the stages of spiral dynamics, so I can flesh it out. So invitation for favorite links. So feel free to share links. I think this is probably going to be the cohort that we'll be running forward with for the next few weeks. So I want to get in the last couple of minutes here to what's next. We would, Emmanuel and I have...
Sorry, can I just one comment on Tim's request? I think we could also just, kind of reply to the group email if anybody has additional information or additional links. And I can probably send out a couple more links on summaries on spiral dynamics. Does that sound good to everyone, or is somebody concerned about getting too many weird emails? Okay, sorry, Devin.
Okay,
right.
So I want to suggest that next week we're going to encourage everybody to have peer-to-peer calls rather than an all cohort call. And I'm going to send an email out with exactly what we're thinking. And in essence, I'd appreciate if everyone would find an article that is appealing to you. And there's a integral journal called Integral Leadership Review, and I'm going to send out the website for that. And I encourage you to find an article that's appealing for you and get together as peer buddies sometime in the next week. And so, you know, part of integral education is peer-to-peer interaction, as well as kind of this facilitated, as well as reflection. So we want to offer that opportunity next week. And the second element is that I'd also like to encourage everyone to reflect back on their own lives and to really give a lot of attention to when you were at these different stages. And what did that feel like within yourself? What was your worldview like? Maybe to draw out some of the gifts that were present there. I'm going to include a little exercise that was, you know, kind of impactful for me to kind of name these different stages just as a bit of a starter. So again, we're not going to be meeting next Tuesday. We'll get back together as a full cohort the following Tuesday, so that's the 18th. But the encouragement is for you to pair up as buddies and to interact amongst yourselves, and you know, arrange a phone call or a Skype call to really explore what you're learning, how that applies to your project, as well as talk about the One Integral Leadership Review article that you found and how these different stages have shown up in your life. So I'll have all that written out in an email that I'll send out as well. Tim, did you have a hand raise?
Yeah, just that I don't see Janet Kingsley's contact info on the email unless she's the House of Embraces or whatever, and I would love to contact her. So I don't see her on the chat list either. Janet, do you have a contact info?
Yeah, I am the House of Embraces. Yes.
Okay, I'm all
House
set.
of Many Embraces.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Do you still have my phone number?
I was trying to find you, so thank you. I'm all set.
so
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
In closing here, can I suggest that maybe Tim and Janet connect as peer buddies? That'd be good.
Yeah. Yep.
Chris, do you want to connect with Cheryl?
Oh, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay, and Rob and Claire, would that be okay? Okay, let's do that. So I will send an email out with that extent. We'll get back together as a cohort and you know, dive into stages as well as what we've learned in 2 weeks. Sound good?
Fabulous.
Okay, I'm grateful
Thank you.
for your involvement and presence here today. Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody,
Thank you.
and we'll have a few.
Have a great
emails.
evening.
Oh, hey,
Thank you.
talk to everybody. Bye bye.